And I want to take a little bit of time now to say something about one of the standards, clarity, and a way of processing things using clarity. This is a major subject of my other focal presentation on standards, but I want to introduce it here because it's such a usable way. Teachers tell me that this is something they can use immediately, again and again with their students. So let me put it up on the overhead. Here it is. It's called SEEI. Let me briefly say, state, elaborate, exemplify, and illustrate. What does that mean? When I state something, remember, this is a way of clarifying. When I state something, I say what it is in a single concise sentence, maybe two. Then I elaborate, and I can say, in other words, and now I spell it out, now in a paragraph or two. In other words, I explain it at greater length. Then I exemplify, meaning I give a good example. Not just any old example, but a good example. And then I illustrate, where an illustration here is meant not as an example, but as a comparison. Something that it's like, a metaphor, a simile, sometimes a picture, or a picture in words. Again, I'm not going into these in any detail at all. But suppose I asked you to talk about your concept of critical thinking, or what I asked you, what is critical thinking as you understand it now? A good way for me to do it would be to say, state what critical thinking is in a single sentence, then elaborate on it, explain it at greater length in a couple of paragraphs. Give me a good example of critical thinking in action, and an illustration. Compare critical thinking to something else. What is critical thinking like? What's a comparison you can make that would clarify your concept of critical thinking, maybe in your own mind, but also bring it home to me more clearly? Okay, one of the items on your, that's SEEI. I can say this. Okay. So suppose you have your students SEEI key concepts in your course. Without the SEEI, what your students have is a definition and your explanation. So if I'm a student, without doing SEEI, all I have is an impression that I understand X, where X is an important concept in the course, or a reading, or a part of the textbook, or a video. All I have is an impression that I understand it. But with SEEI, I get to test whether I actually do understand it. I get to test out whether I understand it enough to be able to explain it, which is very different just from giving a definition. I can explain it. I can come up with an example, not an example that was given in class or in the textbook, but my own example. And I come up with an illustration. Again, not an illustration that was given in class, but my own. So with SEI, I get to test whether I actually understand it. Okay. I'm going to ask you now, just with this level of understanding that you have at the moment of SEI, this may be your first time seeing it. Let me ask you now to reflect and take some notes and be as specific as possible. What are some ways I could have my students use SEEI in my course or class? SEEI is a major way of processing things using critical thinking. So I'm going to leave this up for about 10 seconds, but you can pause at this point. In fact, you should. I'd like to let ideas come to you about how you might use SEEI in your courses or classes. Okay. Okay, so we're back. SEEI. State, elaborate, exemplify, illustrate, a major way of having your students process. I have my students do it all the way through, again and again. They get very used to it. I find they can do it often just in 5 minutes, and it's well worth it. I have them do it about reading. I have them doing, I even have my students do SEI about other classes that they're in. That is, it's a course that requires some writing. And as part of their writing, I ask them to state, elaborate, give an example, and illustrate. And the other teacher doesn't even know that they're doing it, but it just automatically, almost automatically, results in a well thought out explication of something. It's just very nice. We're now going to turn to the major focus of this focal session, and that is the elements of reasoning and designing instruction using the elements of reasoning.